Simon Blackburn is a Professor of Philosophy and a Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. He is known for his work on Quasi Realism and is widely regarded as one of the world's leading philosophers. What is truth, or at least how can we come to think of it?
What is truth is famously Pilate's question, faced with the conflicting views about who Jesus was and what he'd done. The predominant views until recently have been that there ought to be an answer to Pilate's question, an interesting answer. And the standout candidate was always the correspondence theory of truth. Truth consists in correspondence with the facts. As far as I'm aware, the first serious challenges to this, I think there'd always been grumbles that somehow it seemed a fairly useless thing to say because it swapped one problem for another. It swapped the problem of what's truth to the problem of what's a fact. And facts are funny kind of things. You can't weigh them, you can't put them in a bucket, you can't kick them. The facts, for example, aren't structures. They can't be moved. Wittgenstein has a nice example of this. He says that you could move the Eiffel Tower from Paris to Berlin, if you were so minded. Couldn't move the fact that the Eiffel Tower is in Paris anywhere. That fact just stays put. You can destroy that fact, you can stop it being true that the Eiffel Tower is in Paris, but you can't move the fact or pick it up. And so facts are not quite like things. Nevertheless, correspondence theory tries to say that there is a relation between whatever it is we say and the world, and that's the relation of truthfulness, if we're lucky, or truth, if we're lucky, if we get things right. I think the first serious dislike of the theory came from, well, first of all, the great German logician Gottlob Frege, and following him quite a slew of writers in the 20th century, until now. The story I'm about to mention is kind of orthodox, and this is the story known as Deflationism, which says that Pilate was asking the wrong question. Or at least if he asked that question, the only possible answer was to throw it back at him by saying, "What are you interested in?" And then suppose Pilate says, "Well, I'm interested in the truth about whether this guy has been supporting or fomenting a rebellion," then the only answer is a very banal one, which is that, well, it's true that he's been fomenting a rebellion, if and only if he's been fomenting a rebellion. It's up to you to judge whether that's true, but that's just judging whether he's fomented a rebellion, which you can set about doing in a variety of historical ways. So somehow the notion of truth seems to efface itself, it seems to drop out. And in fact, the first name for what's now called deflationism was the redundancy theory of truth. And that was particularly associated with the great British logician Frank Ramsey, who was a friend of Russell and Wittgenstein.
Essentially, aspects of deflationism try to move away from this kind of abstract notion of truth and concentrate much more on concrete, or at least empirically verifiable aspects of truth.
Yes.
A thing you said at the top of the discussion there, which is very important, which is the constitution of a fact, which to some people would seem a bit strange, but what is a fact is very hard to define, and constitutes been a lot of work in this area. So, from my perspective, say a famous school from the early 20th century, which was the critical theory school in Frankfurt, had this problem with fact-value distinction, and it wasn't so clear-cut. Others have made this point as well, but one thing just in everyday general conversation that people would have a trouble understanding this would be it's a fact that the earth goes around the sun. How do we reconcile stuff that is quite clearly a fact with stuff that may not necessarily be a fact?
Good. Well, you're absolutely right that the Frankfurt School, among others, came to despair of sharp distinctions here, fact-value distinctions, empirical, theoretical, observation versus theory, perhaps even language versus non-linguistic fact. The as William James very aptly said, the trail of the human serpent lies over everything. So you're right, the distinctions start to wobble. But I think our everyday distinction has something to do with, first of all, causation. There seem to be facts to which we are causally much better plugged in than others. If I stub my toe on a brick, the fact that I've hit a brick is not in dispute. It's not going to be disputed by anyone, let alone by me. It's a given, as it were, or the nearest thing to a given that we can imagine. Other so-called facts are much more problematic because we don't have a unified or certain way of getting to convergence of opinion on them. And of course, primary amongst those are valuations, where a plurality of views, diversity of views is, as it were, the human condition. So there's no similar way of getting a convergence. There's nothing that corresponds to a so-called verification procedure, which all parties can agree on, and if you plug it in, then out comes the answer yes or no. And those are the areas where factuality seems sort of in question much more. And of course, those were the areas that interested the Frankfurt School. They were interested in social interpretation and social judgment.
Essentially, an argument to be made that even though we can have facts or causal events occurring and aren't disputable on one level, at the same time, it's the underpinning value of that fact that might cause contentious fallouts.
Yes, exactly. Sure, you could think that's fine. That's where science takes us, but it must have been God snapping his fingers that made the thing happen in the first place. Yes, absolutely.
So, for example, Big Bang inflationary model, one can be a physicist about it and be an atheist and still have the same fact and believe that it's still the creation of a God.
Yes, exactly. Sure, you could think that's fine. That's where science takes us, but it must have been God snapping his fingers that made the thing happen in the first place. Yes, absolutely.
Simon, you've given us a very good run through quickly from different versions of truth, but as your previously published book now, nearly 10 years ago, on truth, what do you think are fundamental elements in truth when we consider this thing? What would Simon Blackburn say?
Well, I think I'd start from a deflationist standpoint, but then I'd start to worry what might be objections to that and what might need adding to that. So do we have to tweak it? I'll give you a couple of examples of objections, or at least hurdles, perhaps I should say, that have to be overcome. One is that we use, although Ramsey was right that there's no difference between saying it's true that I've just hit my toe on a brick and I've just hit my toe on a brick, those two come to the same. The notion of truth is redundant there. There are contexts in which it's not redundant. So, for example, if I tell you every proposition is either true or false, something logicians like to say, you can't get rid of the notion of truth or falsity from that sentence. It seems to be essentially about truth or falsity. And you can't substitute just every sentence or something else. That makes no sense. You've got to have it is true or is false. The standard reply to that on behalf of deflationists is very important, and it says, look, the predicate is true itself serves as sometimes said, a device of generalization. And that sounds a bit sort of, tricky. What that means is that it's there precisely to collect together instances where we don't have to mention truth, but to collect them together, we need a word like is true. Let me give you a simpler example. Suppose I tell you, I've just had breakfast with our friend Johnny, and I tell you everything Johnny said at breakfast is true. Well, that's all very well, but I don't tell you what he said. What I do tell you is that what he said was true. What do you take away from that? Well, in a way, you take away a disposition which stands you in the following position. If you learn that Johnny said P at breakfast, then P. If you learn that Johnny said that George Bush believes that Canada is south of the United States, then you learn that if you believe that everything Johnny said at breakfast is true, you learn that George Bush said that Canada was south of the United States, which is probably not the worst mistake he ever made. And if you learn that George Bush said that, cats bark, then you learn that George Bush said that cats bark. And if you learn that George Bush said any of an infinite number of other things, you're in a position to assert those other things, as long as you go on believing that everything George Bush said at breakfast was true. Was that right? I should have said everything George Bush said at breakfast was false. Anyhow, it doesn't matter, it's the same issue. So what logicians got to realize was that the notion of truth has this sort of generalizing or collective function, collecting together function. It enables us to make remarks about whole bunches of propositions, even if we don't know what those propositions are. And that can be very valuable, can give us, as it were, another part of our picture of the world. So redundancy got kicked out. People said it's not redundant in every context. But nevertheless, it's not reintroducing a robust, metaphysical, tricky relation between propositions and things. It's simply giving us a way of generalizing over all the propositions that we might be interested in.
Also, isn't it going to be slightly problematic because certain elements regarding truth and logic are by definition true? So 2 and 2 is 4 by definition. Does that cause a further problem when we talk about truth and logic?
Well, certainly it does. I mean, there's an awful lot of philosophy gone under the bridge. I mean, we can't really, I think, talk about all the arguments that have gone. Sorry, I was just getting a CD out of my computer, putting another one in, making some copies. We can't get into all the arguments that have swirled around this one, but certainly at the beginning of the 20th century, or for the first 30 years or so, a lot of philosophers believed in a very sharp distinction between propositions which are sometimes called analytic, and they're trivial, they're thought of as being true by definition, they're linguistically true, they're, as it were, part of the just how we define things to be, and propositions which have a more chunky and robust content. The first ones are called analytic, the second family is called synthetic, and nearly everybody believed in the analytic-synthetic distinction. Along came the great American philosopher Willard Quine of Harvard, who put the cat amongst the pigeons by challenging that distinction. You mentioned right at the beginning that many distinctions get undermined and overthrown in philosophy, and this is one of them. He said, if you look at the way science puts together its assertions to make up a theory, you don't find a division between what's a matter of definition and what's a matter of substantial fact. If you look at, say, Newton's laws of motion, there's no way of separating out those which are factual and those which are purely definitional. The definition and the facts sort of intermingle. So that was a very important new kid on the block, which both prompted a lot of argument and also prompted a lot of rethinking about the place of the analytic-synthetic distinction. It had existed in its form until then, since the time of Kant.
Within this, if I can just get you to comment on the areas of causation and explanation that go along with this, because obviously a problem just as complicated as truth in philosophy is causation, with different views throughout history. Obviously Hume's very famous for kind of essentially negating an intrinsic view of causation, and the logical positivists that you're partly referring to there in the early 20th century also had that view. But lately, causation, the second half of the 20th century, has come back into vogue a bit more. Well, if you look at the 70s and 80s, someone like Nancy Cartwright and Ian Hacking. But with those terms in mind, because really in everyday terminology. So sometimes we don't want philosophy to be so abstract, and that's a good thing about deflationist views on truth. But how does truth tie in when we say